Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Botanical Biohacking Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Miles. We're going to be continuing with part 3 of the science of tongue diagnosis, and we'll start by discussing tongue lesions. The peeled coating is often seen with cracks. This reminded ancient peoples of a dry and cracked lake bed. It became associated with a lack of yin cooling liquids in blood. Is this pre-scientific hocus pocus, or is there something to it? Tongue lesions have been associated with various disease states in traditional medical systems. 5,034 individuals between 1992 and 1995 in Budapest, Hungary, were investigated for tongue lesions. Tongue lesions were found in 22.76% of all people. The data showed that between 17 to 29% of patients with various chronic illnesses showed signs of tongue lesions. They concluded that the recognition of tongue lesions may be helpful in the early diagnosis of systemic disease. Tongue lesions have been associated with candida and psoriasis. They appear to come about similarly to bleeding gums and skin lesions. A disruption to the local microbiome creates dysbiosis and alters tissue fluid metabolism, leading to dryness. This creates the perfect background for opportunistic infections. The combination of poor fluid distribution, opportunistic bacteria, and derailed immune activity appears to slowly cut through the tissue, leaving lesions and fissures. A similar pathology occurs in the intestines, leading to intestinal lesions which have been associated with many chronic illnesses. Is it possible that tongue lesions may be reflective of lesions occurring in other parts of the digestive tract? Peeled coatings. Oral homeostasis depends largely on proteins and mucins present in saliva that coat all oral surfaces. Fluid homeostasis is also influenced by salivary production. Both mucins and salivary flow are regulated by the neuroendocrine system with gasotransmitters as key mediators. This could be one of the pathways linking hormonal changes and fluid metabolism in the oral and gastrointestinal cavities. One study on peeled tongue coatings in people found to have the traditional diagnosis of liver yin deficiency found that peeled tongue coatings were lower in superficial cells and higher in intermediate cells, which means that the structure had been eroded. There was a lower maturation value of the exfoliated tongue cells. Red tongues with thin coating showed less total bacteria. There was also decreased epithelial cells. What was causing this widespread killing of the tongue microbiome? Could this be indicative of overly excited white blood cell activity? Inflammation with elevated nitric oxide is associated with increased Bax gene signaling and intestinal lesions. The Bax gene signaling causes programmed cell death and appears with overly expressed periodontal pathogens. Gasotransmitter deregulation is associated with dysfunction in fluid metabolism, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and with hormonal deficiencies such as menopausal symptoms and erectile dysfunction. Sex hormones act as antioxidants, which may mediate oxidative damage from inflammatory responses. Could the unchecked immune response be responsible for the damage to the tongue tissue and biofilm? To understand it better, we can look at the most mysterious aspect of tongue coating, the elusive geographic tongue. Geographic tongues, also known as migratory glossitis, appear with seemingly random missing patches on the tongue coating. Interestingly, they've been successfully treated with the topical application of 0.1% tacrolimus ointment. This is an immunosuppressive, and it works by way of reducing overactive T cell expression. Nitric oxide has a regulatory influence on T cells, when it's in the right amount. It seems that the peeling is associated with an overactive immune response. Nitric oxide is a key regulator of adaptive immunity that influences both T lymphocyte activation and the fate decision programs that drive T helper cell differentiation. This would explain why overactive T lymphocyte activity could be present, but could it also explain why areas were peeled in some areas but not others? To unlock the mystery of geographic tongues, I needed to look deeper at the lymphatics of the tongue. If I was to understand the geographic tongue, I would need a map. Lymphatic drainage and the tongue map. Lymphatic fluid is colorless fluid that contains white blood cells. It bathes the tissues of the body and drains through the lymphatic system into the bloodstream. Your white blood cells help defend you by swallowing up pathogens much like the ancient protozoa. Also, like our protozoan ancestors, they release nitric oxide for host defense. They also release both pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines, signaling tissue repair. The lymphatic system is a sort of telecommunication and healing system as much as it is a police station for invading pathogens. Lymphatic drainage occurs in pathways throughout the body, and your tongue's lymphatic drainage is particularly complex in that there are many of these lymphatic roads which pass directly through the tongue. Could they be lending insight into the body as a whole? There are subdivisions or zones within traditional tongue diagnosis which line up identically with the zones of lymphatic drainage. When I say identically, I mean that the regions don't just overlap a little bit. They could be used in a Chinese medical book or for a pop quiz at a Chinese medical school. These regions have traditionally been observed to correspond to various regions of the body. Different regions of the tongue may contain a thick coating or a thin. Some may be completely bare compared to the other areas which may be thickly supplied with tongue biofilm. It may be that the diversity of lymphatic drainage traveling through the tongue makes it a convenient snapshot for understanding the systemic lymphatic flow in the body. Nitric oxide mediates lymphangiogenesis and lymphatic drainage. This may directly reflect the moisture contained in the biofilm of the tongue, causing certain papillae communities to be either soggy or drained based on the actions of the lymphatic system. Being too soggy or too dry leave the tongue body tissue vulnerable. Highly elevated nitric oxide will cause oxidative damage to the lingual papillae, creating dry patches where the biofilm can't attach. From this, we can see the interaction of nitric oxide when it comes to influencing the growing condition of the tongue biofilm. It can block the lymph, causing it to be thick, aid in lymphatic drainage, or damage the underlying tissue, leaving it cracked with lesions. We should remember that this interaction between the polymicrobial enterolingual biofilm and nitric oxide is happening systemically, and so the thickness or cracks we may see on the tongue are very likely reflecting intestinal lesions and bacterial overgrowths found elsewhere in the body. The common primordium and the tongue. The tongue is an elaborate complex of tissues with taste organs of diverse embryologic origin. The tongue begins to form at the 4th week of interuterine life. It is made from the pharyngeal arches which segment the growing fetus. These pharyngeal arches are basically a series of spare tires or fetal muffin tops that later split off from the torso, forming the tongue. We have something of a Franken tongue composed of tissues of various embryological tissue. Over millennia, Chinese medical doctors have recorded that the front of the tongue relates to the upper part of the body, and this is reflected in the embryology, as the first arch is higher up on the body. The second and third arches go on to form the middle and back of the tongue, And the fourth forms the very base of the tongue, which Chinese medicine holds to reflect the center and base of the body. Again, the embryology seems to match up. This goes even deeper with taste receptors and hedgehog signaling pathways found in your internal organs and on the surface of your tongue. In the next episode, we'll explore the connections between the taste receptors on your tongue and the taste receptors found throughout your body.